have been agonizing all day. What music could we play to accompany a show at the end of a week such as we had? What's the Story? Morning Tory was one of those. I listened to Alan Brazil's wonderful interview with Noel Gallagher on our sister station Talk Sport. And Alan, well, only had to gently tease Noel, a man brought up in a council house paid for by the taxpayer, who went to a municipal school paid for by the taxpayer, who was treated as were his siblings, his parents, at the expense of the taxpayer in the National Health Service. A man who enjoyed everything that the socialisation of services could provide. But hey, now he's a multi-millionaire, no longer living on a Manchester council housing estate, but living, don't think it's a secret, he talked about it today, in Chalfont-St-Giles, Chalfont-Saint-Gilles, as some people know it. And miraculously, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, he has experienced a wondrous, truly wondrous change of heart. It is a conversion on the road to Chalfont-Saint-Gilles. Now, he is so afraid of the possibility, only the possibility, of a Labour government coming to power in Britain. Well, him and Alan Sugar and a few others are actually thinking of leaving the beauty of Chalfont-Saint-Gilles and heading out to other climes. In fact, so afraid of a Jeremy Corbyn government is Noel Gallagher that he's even prepared to get back together with Liam and the rest of the boys to reform the band as a tribute, no, not a tribute act, as a retread. He's prepared to do that, even though he hates everybody else involved, rather than deal with a Corbyn government. Then I thought about ABBA. I thought about Rita Young first, actually, when Theresa May danced onto the stage at the Tory party conference. I felt that Rita Young's "I'm sending out an SOS" might have been the most appropriate. Or even if it had to be ABBA, gimme, gimme, gimme a plan after midnight, or money, 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 or SOS, or any number of other songs. But then it was a perilous path to tread, because ABBA have already taken legal action against a right-wing Conservative party in their own country of Sweden for using their music for political purposes without permission. And the word is, though I'm still trying to get through to my old friend Anna Frid, is that her name? Anna Frid or Bethnagard, or they're quite difficult Swedish names, you know. But they are friends of mine. I was trying to get them on the show to tell us what they thought of Theresa May's performance. You can tell us what you thought of Theresa May's performance. 0344 499 1000. You call us, we call you back. We put you on the air, and it doesn't cost you more than a penny or two. I told you last Friday I found the Labour conference profoundly unimpressive and profoundly uninspiring. It won't surprise you if I tell you that the Tory conference was no better for me. Now, I'd never vote for the Conservatives, so there was nothing they could say or do to change my mind. But I view politics as dispassionately as I can. I genuinely mean that I would be giving them credit, at least professionally, if I thought they were hitting the right notes for their own point of view, for their own purposes. But I saw nothing of that. The first thing that struck me about the Tory party conference was how few people were there at some of the most important moments. The shadow Home Secretary was always, or rather the Home Secretary, was always a blue note affair at the Conservative Party conference. Usually the Tory Home Secretary would have to promise more hanging and flogging and locking them up, have to promise more and more law and order, and the bears at the audience would roar as each draconian whack of the birch came down, metaphorically speaking. No doubt some of that was going on behind the scenes, behind their backs. But the Home Secretary today, though most people would struggle to name him, spoke to a hall that was 7/8 empty. Now that tells me something. The age of the people in the conference told me something also. I thought the Labour Party conference was far too young. I mean that. And I'll explain it if you like, if you call me 0344 499 1000. And the Tory Party conference was much, much too old. In fact, the average age of the conference was around 70 years old. That's a problem if you're a living, breathing political party. Now, the measures, there were none. The mangling and the misrepresenting of Jeremy Corbyn, there was much. In fact, if you do as the statos have done and run through a word machine, the word Corbyn was used more often at the Tory Party conference than any other word. That tells me that, like Noel Gallagher, these people are worried. Like the swan, they might be gliding serenely on the surface, but under it, they're paddling like hell, panicking like hell. If they're right to be, and it's not certain that they're right to be, let me school you for a minute. Far too many people think that there is bound to be an early general election. In fact, an early general election is very, very difficult to bring about because we have, thanks to the Lib Dem Tory coalition agreement in 2010, a fixed-term Parliament Act, which means that the next general election will be in 2022, unless the Prime Minister falls in a vote of no confidence and no other member of this Parliament can persuade the Queen that he or she is capable of putting together a majority government in the House. Only in those circumstances, or one other, that 66% of the House votes for an early election. That requires, therefore, a substantial part of the Conservative Party to vote for that early election. It also presupposes that all of the Labour members would vote for an early election. And I'm here to tell you that's not easily presupposed. There are plenty of Labour MPs that would rather see a continuation of Theresa May in office than see a general election that just might, bring Jeremy Corbyn to power. So we'll be talking about the Conservative conference. We've actually got a cracking interview with an expert on that. My colleague, my producer, Tamer, conducted it and as a pre-record, and we'll play it pretty shortly. We'll also be talking about intelligence. It's going to be an intelligent conversation because this week has been dominated not by the Tory conference, maybe that's a coincidence, maybe it's not, dominated by stories of Russian spies. And now, against the grain, quite unexpectedly, most uncomfortably, and thanks to Channel 4 News, which I have myself frequently maligned, Channel 4 News, Alex Thompson, has broken a story that makes your hair stand on end. Let me start with that first. The story that Thompson broke is that for fully 20 years, MI5, our domestic security services, have been operating on British soil with a license to kill. I mean that literally. Not the mythical license to kill enjoyed by MI6's James Bond, a literal license to kill. Not just kill, but commit any number of serious crimes without fear of prosecution. So alarmed was David Cameron when he presumably learnt of this, just 2 weeks before, he had to go to the dispatch box and apologise to the family of my friend Pat Finucane, the Belfast solicitor, who was murdered in his home in front of his wife and children, with the collusion, Cameron admitted, of British security services. 2 weeks before he had to do that, he was writing frantically a letter which Thompson has somehow procured from a tribunal being held in London. And in that tribunal, David Cameron confirms that our spies had a license to kill. And then there's the Russian spies. I can only say this after seeing the pictures and hearing the stories this week. If Russian military intelligence really is of the caliber as is now being alleged, the Russians are in very deep trouble so far as their national security is concerned. The two mugs in the mugshots from Salisbury turn out to be gay men who shared a room in a downmarket East London hotel, who had sex throughout the night noisily, so noisily the police were almost called, who were smoking drugs which could be smelt by the other residents in the hotel, and then spread their mugs over every CCTV camera from East London to Salisbury and back again. The other hotel guests complained about the behaviour of these two men, according to the great British press, of course. Now, that was as nothing compared to what we've seen this week. This week, it is alleged, again in the great British press, that no less than 7 from the same military intelligence services travelled on Russian passports, consecutive passports, dressed like 1980s film extras, and tried to bug a building in The Hague. But so primitive was their equipment that they had to park in the car park with the boot facing the building, open the boot, which was then photographed by Dutch spies, showing Betamax spying equipment that would have looked old-fashioned in the 1980s. If that's the level of Russian cyber warfare, frankly, we've got nothing to worry about. They couldn't even hack TalkSport with equipment like that, not least because you couldn't park outside because the traffic wardens are way too hot. It's farcical, and yet it is dominating policy making, media coverage, the attention of everyone whose job it is to look and listen to media coverage. What's it all about? You see, hey, impartiality, it's a wonderful thing. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back, put you on the radio. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. Remember, you can email me, text me, and also tweet me. Now, everything I just said to you was, of course, derived from the public prints and the broadcasters. We never hear directly from the intelligence services, and I don't suppose we ever will. But we can infer that these reports are, how shall I put it, in journalistic terms, inspired by sources inside the security services. We did hear about the downmarket hotel in East London from the mouth of Neil Basu, the head of the counter-terrorism unit. He said that these two men stayed there and that they left traces of Novichok there. The prince told us about the all-night sex session and the heavy drinking and pot smoking. Pot, that's a very old word. It's a very 80s word. It's a very 80s week. If you were coming to bug The Hague or bug GCHQ, which 1980s character would you come dressed as? I mean, we heard earlier on the news about Johnny English, the accident-prone intelligence man. These chaps from the GRU have nothing on Johnny English. Nothing they do seems to be right. Everything they do seems to lead directly back to them, back to Moscow. If you were a cynic, you'd think, that's a bit suspicious. But my next guest is no cynic. He's a highly respected former British Army officer and security expert. He's Mr. Mike Yardley, and he's here now. Mike, welcome back.
Good evening, George.
Very nice to...
I can hear you're on good form already.
Thank you, my friend. Now, let's start with the revelations this week, at least the allegations this week, that all kinds of GRU men, it's no longer called the GRU, but we'll call it that because that's what everybody is being encouraged to call them. The Russian military intelligence men were bundled out of The Hague, but the same men, it's said, tried to bug doping agents. I mean, for 7 guys they got around, it was said that they were bugging everything, all and sundry. And then we see the pictures of it, Mike, and the material, the equipment they were using, it was Betamax, wasn't it?
Well, there has been a colossal focusing of resources on the Salisbury case. And I have to say that from the start, and I went, a lot of people opposed me on this, and I think we probably disagreed with this. I thought it had the fingerprints of Russian intelligence all over it. Not necessarily the GRU, in inverted commas, Russian military intelligence, the largest external agency. The KGB, of course, split into other agencies as well. The GRU, as it's called, isn't necessarily related to the old KGB. It's still the old Military Intelligence Directorate. But I thought that this did fit a pattern. We'd had the Litvinenko death, of course, Georgy Markov going back into the mist of time. But more recently, a dozen or more people have been attacked by what looked to me to be very clearly Russian Federation interests. Now, it is notable that this particular attack does seem to have been incompetent in many respects. Nevertheless, I don't think just because it was incompetent, we should conclude that it did not happen. I think it's very likely that it did happen. It almost certainly was directed from the Kremlin. Precisely who did it and how it was done, well, I think that will come out in time. The people who were doing it, yes, they were more Johnny English than James Bond, it would appear.
And the ones in the Netherlands, that's you talk about patterns. That's one pattern that's emerging. Is that if I was in British intelligence this evening, I would be less worried about the ability of these chaps to penetrate British state defences, Western state defences, precisely because they seem to be mugs. I mean, the guys in the Netherlands rented a car using a Russian credit card. They came in on Russian passports. 2 of them had consecutive passports. And they were just about the easiest spies to rumble that you could imagine. They were caught in the car park with the boot open and the equipment pointing at the OPCW building.
There does seem to be a really woeful lack of attention to professional detail. But again, I don't think that necessarily means this is a put-up job. I think that just shows you what the resources actually are now and how they may be depleted. And these guys may not be as good as they used to be at their basic tradecraft. I think there really are patterns here. What we see and what we know is that the Russian Federation does have a strategic interest in disrupting both NATO and Europe and the European Union in particular. They see it as in their strategic interest to do that.
We have the alternative strategic interest disrupting them, don't we?
Indeed, we do.
We have spies too.
No, indeed. And when you see the attack on the Skerples, at least one of them, you can see, well, here is a guy who is a double agent, and they're saying, they're sending a message to other people who might be considering to become double agents that this is a very dangerous thing to do. And of course, other people have perished. So this is a war in the shadows, but we mustn't forget that there is a war going on, and it still goes on. I've seen these guys occasionally myself in strange places like Damascus in the past, bumped into the KGB. Indeed, I've bumped into them in Palace Gardens in London in the past as well. They do exist, and sometimes they do look more Johnny English than James Bond. I mean, I've thought that both times personally when I've had physical contact with these sort of characters.
Very few of them look like Sean Connery in his prime.
In reality, they don't.
I mean, I drove past both MI5 and MI6 today and saw a lot of people coming and going. So I know that we have very big intelligence agencies ourselves, and we do spying just like Russians do spying.
I'll tell you what I found most curious, George, and I'm genuinely interested in your opinion in this. When the attack in Salisbury first happened, you and I both follow social media quite a lot.
Yeah.
The far right were supporting the Russian line, that it was an MI6 operation or a foreign intelligence service operation outside of Russia and nothing to do with the Russians. And there has been a great deal of evidence since. Some people still call that into question, but I think most people now accept that this was a bungled Russian operation. But what I found extraordinary was why the far right in Britain and elsewhere was suggesting that this was, in fact, a false flag operation. And that is an interesting deal. You'd expect people on the far left possibly to say that, people who had in the past been sympathetic to the Soviet regime, although, of course, Putin's regime is a very different regime to that. It is not overtly Marxist, etc., etc. But I thought it was extraordinary that the British far right seemed to be accepting the Kremlin line on the Salisbury poisoning. So what do you think was going on there?
Well, that's an interesting question. It would take a long time to give a full answer. Let me try in the time available. First of all, there were never many people on the left in Britain sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Most people on the left in Britain were either from the Michael Foot Bevanite tradition, called themselves democratic socialists to differentiate themselves from Soviet communism, or they were Trotskyites. A very large number of Trotskyites, 57 varieties of Trotskyites, we used to say, who hated the Soviet Union every bit as much as people on the right then hated it for schismatic reasons. And those who were sympathetic to the Soviet Union are now very small in number as old Father Time has taken them. The right like Putin because he's white, because he's fighting Islamist extremism in Syria and in the Caucasus, in Chechnya and so on, and they see a cotermity with their own views about Islam and about Muslims and so on. Although Russia today is a multinational country, anyone who goes to Moscow is amazed at the number of different former Soviet nationalities that are living there. So it's very much a multinational, it's not a white country, Russia. But from the outside, I think the far right looks at it as a kind of bastion of white Europeanism, as opposed to the Western European countries, which they would characterize as mongrel in character, mixed.
I think that's a good answer, George, and I think they do see him as a white nationalist.
Yes.
But
he is white and he is a nationalist. So, I mean, they're right about that. He's just not a nationalist about being white. He's a Russian nationalist.
Indeed. But what I was also found interesting, and again, we may be differ in opinion on this, but was how susceptible these people were, to the various lines, being put out by various Russian news agencies. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be skeptical of the BBC and our own news agencies. You and I, both, we may have different politics, but we're both very skeptical of the system, of the establishment.
I think intelligent people need to be skeptical about all sources, don't we?
We do. And, I say to people, multi-source your information. Put a bit of effort into it. Don't just accept what's given to you on a plate, because you're not going to be finding out reality that way. The only way, you've got to put effort in. If you want real news, you have to put personal effort in. And I say to my kids and other people, doubt everything with a loving heart. That's where I think. That's
a very good line. Einstein put it this way: when the facts change, so do my opinions. And he went further and said, "What about you? When the facts change, and if your opinions don't change with the facts, you're a fool." For example, I'm in no doubt at all that Russians were involved in the Skripal case. Whatever happened there involved Russians, interactions between Russians. The key, the solution to this crime definitely lies in a Russian polity or a Russian milieu. I'm in no doubt at all about that. I still don't believe that the Russian government sent these people there. I believe the Russian government would have sent better people to do a different kind of job if that's what they intended to do. And if
your position, George, is you're suggesting that rogue agents of some sort, elements of...
Or criminals. I personally believe, if you forced me to divulge my own opinions, which is dangerous in this business, my own opinions are that the secret here lies in criminal activity rather than in politics.
But of course, some people would say that today the Russian state itself is a mafia state, is a criminal state. So those distinctions between what is official and what is criminal have been severely blurred.
Yeah, in a lot of states, of course, have mafias, and of course, no state is fully in control of all of its intelligence agents, and we'll be coming on later to this tribunal, which has been leaked to Channel 4 News, which shows just how lawless, potentially, our own security services were, particularly in the north of Ireland. I don't know if you're across that story, but we'll be talking about it in the last hour.
It is an interesting story, and I've actually just come back from Northern Ireland and will be going there again soon. And it is sad to see the tensions that are brewing there. And I have personal
definitely rising, yeah.
Both sides of the political divide, some of whom were involved in the political process. And what all of them tell me, and I just mention this as I got the chance, is there must not be another border. There mustn't be a hard border again. I have people from both sides telling me that. That is a recipe for disaster and to bring back the troubles, or at least to bring back conflict.
So to sum up, what do you think happened in The Hague, at these other sites, and in Salisbury?
I think this is a projection of Russian power. I think basically Salisbury was theatre. It was sending a message. It was saying, if you cross us, we will get you. The only problem is I do not think that the GRU is what it used to be. I think their tradecraft capability is not what it was. That doesn't mean they can't undertake operations, but it means they may not always go the way they hoped they would.
Well, expenses in the GRU can't be what they used to be either, or you wouldn't be relying on the Sunday service of public transport to make your getaway to Heathrow Airport. Listen, Mike, it's always interesting and often fascinating to talk to you and get your point of view, and we'll discuss it now with the listeners. Thank you very much for being with us. 0344 499 1000. 0344 499 1000. Now, whose campaign tune was this? I'll give you a clue. It nearly won. Great song, actually. Fleetwood Mac. Not such a great political leader who adopted it as their campaign tune. Let's hear from you. Now, Mr. Anonymous is back on the line. at 25 pence plus normal charges. Changed your tune now, George. Glad to see you eating your words. You were a fool at the very beginning of this Russian farce. Stop trying to wriggle out of it. Presumably, Mr. Anonymous, you sent that before I restated my view just a couple of minutes ago. I haven't changed my tune at all. I'm sceptical of all sources. I don't believe what intelligence sources tell me because I lived as a parliamentarian through the Iraq debacle. I certainly don't believe political leaders. I have been saying for months that the two individuals in the mugshots from Salisbury were involved in what happened to Mr. Skripal and his daughter. I didn't believe, and said so from the start, that they had made 2 trips to Salisbury to see Stonehenge or Salisbury Cathedral. This I stated from the very beginning, and it's on the public record. I don't believe, didn't then, don't now, and won't until the facts change, if they change, that these 2 individuals were Russian intelligence officers sent to Salisbury to kill with a nerve agent a released spy living quietly, apparently quietly, in Salisbury. I don't believe that. And that is my tune, Mr. Anonymous. Chris says the right wing support Putin because he is strong, patriotic, and isn't an ultra-liberal, unlike our spineless, pathetic, ultra-liberal politicians. That's a terrible way to speak about Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Ultra-liberals. My goodness. Here's Martin in Doncaster. Go ahead, Martin.
Hello, George. I'm speaking on a lighter note tonight.
Okay.
It's songs to describe the appalling things at the Tory party conference.
Yes. Were you impressed by the conference? Tell me that first.
Yeah. Sorry, George?
Were you impressed by the conference?
Not at all. I mean, of course, predictably, the Fleet Street, what remains of the Fleet Street press were, according to them, it was the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah, in fact, one of the newspapers ran the same headline by the same writer, under the same editor, that they ran exactly 12 months before.
Oh, yeah.
Austerity is over, says May.
Yeah, I mean,
12 months later.
Yeah, I mean, Theresa May just spent the whole of her speech attacking Jeremy Corbyn, which to me suggests that they're frightened,
Yeah, I mean, it's like advertising. You're not supposed to be advertising the opposition. It's a sign of anxiety and nervousness,
yeah,
isn't
I think they think it's a foregone conclusion. I think Jeremy Corbyn must be, totally satisfied with everything at the moment, really.
Well, he's definitely the bookies' favourite to win, but it depends when, doesn't it?
Of course, yeah.
If this whole Brexit thing collapses in
and of course,
debacle, and if a taxi load of DUP MPs gets lost on the way to Westminster on the night of a vote, none of which is impossible, of course.
Of course no.
It's definitely possible that we could have an early election. But if it's 2022, I'm not sure it'll be Jeremy Corbyn that's the Labour candidate then.
Do you think so?
I'm not sure. I'm not certain, no. He's 70 by 2022. He's 74, makes him 79 at the end of a full term. Yeah. It's possible, of course, and I pray for his long life and good health.
Also do I.
And I very much hope that he's still in the saddle. But again, I don't think that's a foregone conclusion.
But I mean, he's so serene, isn't he?
Yes, zen.
I don't think any other individual could have withstood what's been thrown at him,
Well, he's definitely strong, and strong in a zen kind of way.
Absolutely.
Strong and stable, you might say, if you were borrowing a description from someone else. Anyway, you had some song. Give me some film characters, some song titles that summed it all up for you.
Okay, and the irony is in the title in this one, and if you ever listen to the lyrics, it sums up exactly what you're trying to do. It's I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor by the Arctic Monkeys.
Well, you're a younger man than me if you know the Arctic Monkeys tracks.
I'm not, George.
Good for you then.
Okay, the second one you will know, it's The Robot by Kraftwerk.
Yes.
And the third one...
Kraftwerk, that would be ironic. They're German, aren't they?
Oh, yes, of course. Oh, by the way...
She did look
before...
Kraftwerky, robotic-y.
Yeah, before I give you the last one, you know you were mentioning ABBA and their opposition to the use of their music?
Yes.
Do you know the backdrop to why they're so opposed to it?
No.
Because they're such fervent Remainers, Theresa May is leading the Brexit negotiations.
Oh, I see. Yeah, but they have a form of... they took action, legal action, against a right-wing party in Sweden for using their music.
And I've got one final one.
Yeah?
I think this sums it up. It's Walk the Dinosaur by Was Not Was.
Very good. Thank you for the music, Martin in Doncaster. Had to get that one in. Patrick Vidin says, Netherlands withdrew support for the white helmets in September, so became out of step with the establishment agenda. So presumably they had to make up for their honest divergence. So this latest ridiculous caper to bug the OPCW is likely to be staged. Well, presumably, likely, more than likely, almost certainly. I mean, these are the words that we have to keep using in all of this because a lot of it is just pure speculation. Let me compare and contrast. In the run-up to the Iraq war, Claire Short, then a cabinet minister, presumably therefore to be believed, told us that the British security services, not the Americans, the British, bugged the entire Security Council of the United Nations so that they could tell how people were likely to vote on the issue of the war. That's what she claimed. I can't prove it, but she claimed it. And she was a member of the war cabinet, you will remember. If she hadn't told us, we would never know. None of the targets knew that the British were bugging them. And that was in 2003. May even have been in late 2002. 16 years later, the Russians are so far behind technologically that they literally have to go to the car park of the building that they're seeking to bug. And not only that, they have to point the boot at the building, and they have to allow to stick out this Betamax 1980s technology in order to do so. And then they are descended upon by the Dutch security services who are watching the whole thing, as might have been expected. I may add, the OPCW building in The Hague must be 24 hours, 7 days a week guarded. The idea that 4 burly men in a hired car pointing their boot at the building and fiddling around with very old technology in that boot is likely to have drawn attention. So, either it's a divergence, or it's a setup, or it's clownish, or the Russian security services really are that bad. And if I was a Russian, I'd be asking Putin, are our security services really that bad? Because if they are, then it's trouble. We did ask the OPCW for comment, by the way, but they declined. Christina says, did I hear George Galloway correctly? Did George suggest he was not impressed with the Labour conference? I was very impressed with the Labour Party conference. Well, Christina, I did say last week at the end of the conference that I wasn't impressed by it. On a whole number of levels, I thought it was pretty shambolic from a professional standpoint, something that's being watched by the nation as a whole, as opposed to political activists. I didn't think it was all that polished, all that smooth, but much more importantly, 2 things happened at the conference. I say 2, I could have said 5, that made me distinctly unimpressed. First of all, the open selection motions were defeated, and therefore a whole string of very damaging brouhahas are looming as people in certain constituencies try to replace their current MP with another one. And it will have to be a negative campaign, because you'll have to mount a campaign that the MP you've got at the moment isn't good enough and needs to be replaced. Whereas if open selection had passed, every MP, every election, would have to be automatically re-adopted. And secondly, as I said last week, a conference where Labour emerges with three different policies on Brexit, having conceded a second referendum as a possibility, with the Shadow Foreign Secretary saying that the second referendum should offer the Norway option, the EEA, European Economic Area option, the Brexit Shadow Secretary, Sir Keir Starmer, saying that actually cancelling Brexit should be on the agenda, and John McDonnell, on behalf of himself and Jeremy Corbyn, saying that if there was to be a second referendum, remaining in the EU cannot be an option. So who do we believe? John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn, Sir Keir Starmer, or Emily Thornberry? Now, a conference which leaves that question entirely unclear is not an impressive conference, in my view. Jimmy says songs for Theresa May. I would say Paranoid by Black Sabbath, or Dancing Days by Led Zeppelin, or Dancing in the Streets by David Bowie and Mick Jagger, or Martha and the Vandellas. I must say I love Bowie and Jagger's version. That was at the time of Live Aid. Andrew says it could be a double bluff. Putin could be using the clowns to lull the UK into a false sense of security, while the real spying is undetected. Yes, that could be true. There's a paradox at the heart of all this. Tom Watson called today for a Mueller-style inquiry into how the Russians fixed Brexit. If your security services are clowns, how did they manage to trick 17.4 million British people into voting for Brexit? Just asking. Asking for a friend. 0344 499 1000. Bob Justice says, an interesting week. The GRU are running around Europe using 1980s Taiwanese knockoffs from Peckham Market for snooping operations. Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem did a concert in Birmingham, and the Pound Shop Churchill Tribute Act became a suspect in making crop circles. How fantastic is that? Let me squeeze in a bit of hate. Here we go, it's Friday. It's the mother of all poo stirrers, getting excited about niche subjects in a niche way. Good job, it's a niche show for the niche opinions of the Pied Piper Galloway. Toot my flute and watch the bum lickers queue to sing my praises. Thanks for listening, Simon, and spending on a text or many every single week. Now, I did say it's a two-way street and you can talk back to the teacher, and it doesn't cost you anything at all beyond the text price, that is. And here is a very long and serious text from Peter. It says, George, I'll try and be brief. The Russian spies whose job it is to spy are being condemned by our spies who spy on them. Every country spies on each other, including organizations, to gather intelligence. The US hacked Angela Merkel's phone, its own ally. I believe the Russians were trying to hack into the OPCW simply to get the full information of the investigation, which was being withheld against international law. Other chemical elements were found in samples given by Britain. The OPCW is not as independent as it's made out to be. All this is timed to coincide with the findings of the MI5 tribunal and the Putin meeting India's Modi to sign a $5.4 billion deal with the US threatening India if it buys Russian equipment. The deal was signed today. The US wants the world to buy its equipment, its technology and its oil, and cannot compete fairly, so it results to bullying and threatening nations. This is a commercial and political attack on Russia to destroy its economy. Of course, Russia denies hacking, as standard with all spy agencies. We constantly lie about Syria and Ukraine, Iraq and Libya. Lest we not forget, more information is emerging in Washington of GCHQ, Skripal and Steele being used in a coordinated attack to prevent and then remove Trump as president. This is an absolute disgrace for our intelligence agencies to be used politically to subvert foreign elections. Nothing new. The US has done it over 80 times. Why, you ask? Because Trump promised non-intervention and to withdraw from Syria and Afghanistan. Our country has invested far too much in the terrorists propagating a war to overthrow Assad. And will the intelligence services interfere in our next election if the candidate is not to their liking? Salisbury is not as it's being played out to be. Well, of course, the timing is interesting, Peter. I lean towards the cock-up rather than the conspiracy theory in most things, but the coincidence is clear. Putin did a $5.4 billion deal with India, one of the world's emerging economies, this very day, as you say, including the purchase of anti-missile batteries, which India will now be sanctioned by the US for buying, as China has been sanctioned for buying, and as the Syrians will presumably be punished for having been given by Russia. Of course, everybody spies, and everybody spies on each other's spies. There's intelligence, there's counterintelligence. And of course, we have counterintelligence officers spying on the spies who are spying on us, and they have counterintelligence officers spying on our spies that are spying on them. It's very clear. I just read a very interesting book by Ben McIntyre, the associate editor of The Times, in conjunction with Oleg Gordievsky, who was recruited by Britain inside the KGB in the 1970s. And indeed, he briefly became the head of the Residentura of the KGB in London, whilst being a British agent. And he was captured by the Russians and sprung by the British. He was sprung by the British using not just our spies in Moscow, but a blue-blooded aristocrat and his wife, who were our spies in Moscow. So we've got lots of spies in Moscow and lots of spies everywhere. It's also true that President Obama, the saintly President Obama, was bugging the telephone of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor, the personal telephone, by the way, the mobile telephone of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of one of America's closest allies. So there are all kinds of spying. My point is this, Peter, which you haven't addressed. The operation in The Hague was so farcical, so absurd, so ramshackle, so 1980s, that I find it difficult to take at face value. As I say, there's a paradox here. We're told that the Russians are masters. They can spark off an insurrection in Catalonia. They can rig Brexit. They can fix the referendum in Macedonia. They can put their man in the White House in the United States. They can rig Brexit in Britain. Wonderfully sophisticated operation. Except when we catch them, it's a group of burly, obviously Russian guys in the car park at the OPCW in The Hague. That's all I'm saying. I'm drawing attention to the paradox. Bye-bye Blighty says Britain has apparently hard evidence that Ruskolok's has been sleeping in Baby Bear's, Mummy Bear's and Daddy Bear's beds. In addition, they found a breadcrumb trail from Salisbury to the Kremlin. X-Ray Vision says, I still can't believe Putin ordered Salisbury and The Hague. Putin would be furious at the outcome, a fiasco. It's almost as if the perpetrators were trying very hard to get caught. I don't know why the Russians don't come absolutely clean on the two guys in Salisbury. If it was me, if I was Putin, I'd say, we've now found these two guys, even though you didn't give us any help in finding them, and we're going to put them on trial. if you won't come here to question them, we're going to put them on trial in public. Because the victim of the Salisbury affair was, of course, a Russian citizen. And his daughter, who was not just a Russian citizen, but was a resident in Russia. Incidentally, you may have seen this week in the press that Skripal himself did not believe that it was the Russian state that had attacked him. It's not clear, but it's implicit that he's changed his mind about that. But in the beginning, he did not believe that it was the Russian state that attacked him. I think the Russians could be much more clear about this. They would say, well, the diplomatic channels are open and the British won't use them, and that's true. But if you've got nothing to hide, then why stop at that? Why say, well, if you won't put these people on trial, we will? I think that would be a good thing to do. Here's another message from Peter, who wrote that long message. George, my point was that if they had hacked the OPCW, it's quite understandable, as with the investigation into MH13. When a country is accused of a crime, it should be allowed to see all the evidence. Well, that's, of course, a good point. A counterpoint would be, if you had actually done the crime, why would you need to hack it? Because you already knew what happened. It's all very curious. Thanks, Peter, for that. George, you said it wasn't Russian state involved in Salisbury because it was close to the World Cup. Didn't stop them invading Afghanistan just before the Moscow Olympics did it. That's true. That's a good point. A very good debating point. Except it wasn't Russia that invaded Afghanistan. It was the Soviet Union that invaded Afghanistan. Russia is another capitalist country. This is the meta-narrative, which I keep trying to move on to. Why are relations so bad between countries that have virtually identical economic forms? Why? Why couldn't, when communism collapsed, Russia have been absorbed into the capitalist world? After all, Yeltsin was in power, privatizing everything. We didn't even recruit Skripal until 1996. Long after the Soviet Union had died and when our man was in the Kremlin, lying drunk on the floor while people were picking his pockets. Why did we need a spy in Moscow in 1996? Communism was dead. The Soviet Union was dead, is dead. If you want an example of how capitalist Russia now is, there's Putin in India today doing business with an extreme right-wing government, a government of very dubious internal politics towards meat-eaters, towards religious minorities, towards Sikhs, for example. Wars are breaking out across India. But Putin's there. Why? For business. Just business. It's only business. Just like us. Just like the Americans. So a good debating point, but no cigar. Albert Trigg says, I'm not changing my opinion on the McCarthyite propaganda against Russia. The official Skripal narrative remains almost comical, were it not for the seriousness of the deterioration in the relationship between nuclear-armed nations. That's the point, Albert. Relations have deteriorated to the point that a US official said in public this week that America would take out Russia's nuclear weapons, which is a declaration of a first strike, a first preemptive nuclear strike, which of course means world war. It doesn't get much more serious than that. And again, I'm asking the question, why? Bob Justice says, Tory conference song, The Party's Over by Nat King Cole. One for the Maybot, If You Can't Dance, the Spice Girls. Some for Williamson and the Media. Back in the USSR, the Beatles. Mad World, Tears for Fears. 99 Red Balloons by Nina. And The End of the World by Julie London. Now, the Tory conference was not a success. From my point of view, if the Tory conference had been packed out, if the Tory ministers had had a programme for government, if they'd had policies that they wanted to launch and sell, if their oratory had been above third-year debating society level, I would tell you that was a successful conference, even if I disagreed with every word that was said in it. I'm talking to you as a professional. It was not a successful conference. First of all, it spent most of its time talking about the opposition, which is never a good sign. You know, if a motor car company came on here advertising its wares, but all they did was trash the alternative motor cars that are available, you'd begin to doubt their confidence in their own model, wouldn't you? It's a synonym of good advertising that you don't mention the opposition. You certainly don't mention them by name. But when I tell you, and I've read the stats, the word Corbyn was the most used word at the conference. Not the word Conservative, not the word Tory, not strong and stable, not our policy for government, not ABBA, not Maybot, none of these things. Corbyn was the word most used at the conference. And so I got to thinking, here's a party in government that is insecure and doesn't feel that it's necessarily there for the long term. The clue was in the letter of no confidence that one of Boris Johnson's top men put in half an hour before the Prime Minister got up to speak. Now, as an act of treachery, that's pretty serious. To attempt to steal the Prime Minister's thunder by announcing your no confidence in her before she's even got up to speak, well, as treason goes, that's pretty treacherous. Boris Johnson was the second most noted person at the conference, even though, like Corbyn, he wasn't there. He never appeared at the conference, but he dominated the coverage. His speech at the Fringe was a roaring success. It was packed out in a way that the conference sessions rarely were. The media hung on every word. His trousers didn't fall down. He didn't take his trousers down. He didn't run off with anyone's wife, daughter, or sister. He was on message, and his message was Chuck Checkers. Chuck Checkers sounds like a 60s twist song. Chuck Checkers is his message. Now, given there's 100 Tory MPs, at least, determined to chuck Checkers, given that the European Union wants Theresa May to chuck Checkers, and given that the Labour Party will not vote for Checkers, that has to be a note that finds an echo. And Boris Johnson did find an echo. So here's my reading. There won't be a general election anytime soon, but there will be a different Prime Minister. I believe that Boris Johnson will be the next Prime Minister of Britain, that Theresa May will be forced out of office, either now or immediately after she fails to get her deal through the House of Commons, which I've been saying to you not for months, but for years. No Brexit deal can pass the current House of Commons, and therefore we're going to crash out of the EU without a deal, and we'll have a new Prime Minister to pilot the ship on the stormy seas that will ensue. Quite an important interview on the Tory conference coming up after this.
Things can only get better.
Well, whose song was that? I hated it at the time. Now I know why. Ah, George, gone are the days when tiny dino hands was feeding the koi carp half a loaf of bread. Now it's all Russia did this and Russia did that. If it wasn't for Doogie, who might show his views, I wouldn't listen. Only kidding. but I do think we need a new subject, says Big Al. And Lizzie says, lovely having a cuppa with you while the lad Tamar subs. George Galloway Talk Radio, is this the first step to replacing you? Listener numbers will literally fall off a cliff, mate. Sorry. And David Leviscont says, what is this? Where's George? Well, I'm here. And I'm going to interview now Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics at King's College London, on austerity. Professor, thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Mrs. May has, for the second time in a year, said that austerity is over. In fact, one newspaper, written by the same journalist, edited by the same person, in the same paper, in identical words, announced both ends of austerity, one of them 12 months ago and one of them this week. Has it ended? How can we tell?
We'll be able to tell much better after the budget, which will come at the end of this month. And frankly, until we see the budget, declaring an end to austerity isn't worth the paper it's written on. What we know is that under current plans, we've had quite a lot of austerity, but there's an awful lot of austerity still to come, particularly continuing large cuts to local authority funding, which translates into cuts to everything from social care, cuts to police, and so on. Quite a lot of cuts still to come, and even bigger than that, lots of cuts to people's benefits, to people who currently get tax credits as they move on to universal credit. Now, is Philip Hammond going to reverse some or all of that? We don't know, but he hasn't said anything to suggest that he will. Probably there'll be a bit of reduction in how deep those cuts are, but I don't think you could really call that an end to austerity in any meaningful sense.
No, it didn't work, did it? 8 years of austerity. The debt is greater now than it was before the austerity began. So calling it off now will inevitably lead to the question, well, what was it all for?
Well, it is true that, the debt was always going to go up because we had a large deficit 8 years ago, and even under George Osborne's original austerity plans, which of course he soon abandoned, the deficit was going to continue at quite a rate for a while. So of course the debt has gone up, and that in itself is not a failure. The deficit has come down by quite a lot. So in that narrow sense, austerity has worked, and you'd expect it to work. If you cut public spending a lot, and you don't cut taxes, then you reduce the deficit. That's just arithmetic. The question is whether it worked economically and socially. And there, I think, although there's plenty to argue about, the evidence is pretty clear that it hasn't worked. We've had very slow growth, a very slow recovery by the standards of every previous recession, no growth to speak of in real wages over 10 years, which is historically completely unprecedented. How much of that do you blame on austerity? It's very difficult to tell, but certainly some of it. So economically, austerity hasn't been a great success. And then socially, of course, I think in the first few years of austerity, because of the investment that has gone into public services before that, there was actually a reasonable amount of slack. There was some fat to be cut in the public services. And so we didn't notice it. But in the last few years, the cuts have really hit the bone, and we're seeing that in terms of things like the rise in homelessness, the waiting lists in the NHS, rises in crime. All of those are clearly, to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, the result of austerity.
It's a triumph of accountancy over economics, isn't it? Didn't we learn in the 1930s that when you're in a recession, cutting is the precise opposite of what you should do?
We did, and the governments of the world, led by Gordon Brown, of course, learned that lesson and did take quite radical action in 2008 and 9, not to cut and indeed to spend more to try and help us avoid the equivalent of the Great Depression, and it worked. Unfortunately, I think in many ways it worked too well. People sort of breathed a sigh of relief, said, okay, it worked. We used the Keynesian approach during the crisis, and we staved off a Great Depression. We can go back to normal now, and of course, normal means getting deficits back under control and doing the normal sort of things that you do when you're not at the risk of a Great Recession. And unfortunately, we did that. We thought we'd got back to normal, and we really hadn't, and we've seen that in the last 10 years. So I think you're right. We did put accountancy over economics after the initial phase. We got it right initially, but then we unfortunately changed course too quickly, and that was a big mistake. And to be fair to this government, it wasn't just here. Again, that was an international failure just as much as a UK one. And indeed, things are much, much worse in some other countries.
And it's upset apple carts everywhere. The rise of Brexit, the rise of Trump, excuse me, the rise of populist parties across Europe, most of them right-wing, some of them left-wing, some of them left and right. All of those have emerged from the carnage of austerity, haven't they?
Well, that is a very complicated question, and there's no doubt that austerity contributed. I think we also have to recognise that austerity is not the only explanation. I mean, Hungary and Poland, which have the nastiest populist governments, verging on fascist in some ways, have actually had a much better economic performance over the last 15 years. They haven't really suffered the impacts of austerity at all compared to us, let alone compared to places like Greece. So it's not as simple as that. But I think it is fair to say, and there is a fair amount of research which supports this now, that Brexit was to a significant degree driven by austerity. That is, I think, is fair.
Now, my son, 11-year-old, asked me for a definition of austere last night for his homework. I gave a definition which didn't have anything to do with economics, but just in closing, what do they mean by austerity? Why do they choose that word? Is it a sanitized way of talking about cuts and so on? Does it date back to Philip Snowden, the austere chancellor, who disastrously stuck to the gold standard and helped pave the way to the 1930s Great Depression?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it is fair to say that austerity is chosen because it sounds, upright, straight-laced, and responsible and sober, as opposed to profligate, presumably, which is in some ways the opposite, right? We economists tend to prefer a sort of very neutral term, fiscal consolidation, which
that sounds even more sanitized to me.
Well, it is sanitized, but it's not intended to be either positive or negative. It's just a technical term. I think from the point of view of the public, it's we're talking what is austerity. It's spending cuts and tax rates,
and it's pain, isn't it? I mean, people will never get that 10 years back in their lives in which wages have been frozen. In some cases, in real terms, cuts. We've got the police up in arms at the idea that austerity is over when the government is effectively reducing their salaries. The pain that people suffered has left a scar, don't you think?
Well, it's certainly true that we will, as I said, it's not clear just how much of that pain is due to austerity, but certainly a considerable amount. And yes, we probably won't get most of it back. That's right. And that is a big difference with past recessions, when actually in most past recessions, we've recovered quite a bit of the ground lost in the recovery afterwards. In this one, we haven't. And that is something that at this point, I think many of us in the first 2 or 3 years thought, well, we'll get some of it back at least. And we were wrong. We haven't got it back yet, and we may never get it back.
Yep. Professor, thanks very much for helping us with that. Professor Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics at King's College London. There's a breaking story in The Guardian of some importance in regard to Tamar's interview with our academic earlier. The headline is, May secretly woos key Labour MPs to back her Brexit deal. Theresa May has drawn up plans for a secret charm offensive aimed at persuading dozens of Labour MPs to back her Brexit deal, even if it costs Jeremy Corbyn the chance to be Prime Minister, The Guardian has learned. Senior Conservatives have already been in private contact with a number of Labour MPs over a period of months, making the case that the national interest in avoiding a no-deal outcome is more important than forcing a general election by defeating the government on May's Brexit deal. Well, I hate to say I told you so, but I did tell you so. I have been telling you for a long time that the opposition to Corbyn within the Labour Party would much rather see Theresa May continue in office and Brexit be blunted than to see Theresa May brought down and a general election potentially forced. I told you that over and over again. Some of you thought I was being alarmist. The Guardian now says it's underway. A story so dramatic that only Alex Thompson of Channel 4 News could have broken it, the others wouldn't have, has emerged in the last 24 hours. At a tribunal in London, a letter from the then Prime Minister David Cameron was divulged, I think we can say, in discovery, which would make your hair stand on end. It was a letter in which, in writing, the Prime Minister of the day confirmed that the British Security Service, MI5, which operates on British soil, and by British, of course, I include the 6 counties of the northeast of Ireland, which is probably a significant point to make, because it turns out, as the Prime Minister had to admit and apologise for just 2 weeks after he wrote the letter, the British Security Services were involved in murder and mayhem in the north of Ireland. Annie Machan is a former MI5 intelligence officer, and she's good enough to join us now. Annie, thank you for coming on the show. Did you know you were licensed to kill when you were an MI5 officer?
No, I didn't. And in fact, I wasn't. I was an MI5 officer back in the early 1990s when these discussions were fairly mainstream, and the ethics around how far you could allow agents to go was a live discussion. But
so what happened then? Did the rules that governed you run out? I mean, what is this hiatus that's discussed, a 20-year hiatus, when effectively the security services were entitled to commit crimes without fear of prosecution?
Well, I think we need to get the terminology precise in this case, because we have a situation where David Cameron is talking about allowing agents and giving guidance to agent handlers, agent runners, about how far they can go. So just to clarify, if you work for MI5 in the UK, you work as an intelligence officer, you run the operations, or you run agents. Now, the agents are not employees of MI5. They're not full-time employees. They are people who are either infiltrated or turned within organisations that MI5 wants to spy on. So it's the agents they're talking about here, not the employees of MI5. So there is a distinction there. However, I do think it's interesting.
Can I press you on that? I mean, you say I would argue it's a difference it's a distinction without a difference. You see, my friend was murdered in Belfast, Patrick Finucane, in front of his wife and children, by an agent of our intelligence officers. And it turns out that they had a green light to do that, as Cameron admits in that letter. So it's a distinction, but is it really different?
In terms of the roles of what the people are doing, yes, it is incredibly different. However, in terms of the distinction of the moral and ethical element, I think there are still obviously very big problems around it. I mean, I'm aware of the Pat Finucane case. I'm also aware that WikiLeaks, I think in 2010, revealed documentation around exactly what happened. And I'm also very aware of the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and government collusion with some of the crimes that occurred there. But what we're looking at here is agents who are being run by officers, and they have to build up a legend, a cover. in order to penetrate these groups. And this happens not just with MI5, it also happens with the undercover police officers who might be trying to infiltrate drug gangs. So are you going to say to someone who wants to try and build up a relationship with a drug gang, a criminal gang, they can't buy or sell drugs, for example, because that's how they would build up their profile within that gang?
That's a fair point.
Yeah, and similarly as well, though, we've also had the undercover cop scandal, where undercover policemen have posed as activists and got involved in very intimate relationships with the female activists. And of course, those are going
Had
through the
children
courts
with
at the
them.
moment. Absolutely. And those females feel, violated, and so they should. So I think the key point here is actually trying to find a certain degree of illegality or oversight or accountability, and that needs to be written into law. And the very fact that Prime Minister David Cameron back in 2012 had to write guidelines shows that it is not written into the law. There is no proper oversight, there is no proper accountability, and that is the problem here.
It's obviously as you were talking, I was thinking, for example, if you were seeking to infiltrate, say, a violent animal rights movement, you would undoubtedly have to be credible, get involved in some criminal acts, and the undercover police working in that field definitely did. If you were, as you just mentioned, involved in other kinds of campaigns, you do have to build up that legend. But when the legend requires killing people, that has to be so morally wrong that the absence of a legal prohibition for doing it's a major scandal that no such legal prohibition existed, don't you think?
I absolutely agree, yes. And that's why this letter that's emerged about MI5 and just giving them guidelines is a shocker. I mean, even MI6, our sort of foreign intelligence gathering organisation, the James Bonds of the British intelligence, as they like to say, even they are legally required to get prior written permission from their political master, the Foreign Secretary, under the terms of the Intelligence Services Act, Section 7, which came out in 1994, in order to carry out actions abroad which would otherwise be deemed to be illegal. If they get that permission, they are given legal immunity from prosecution in the UK. Now, MI5 doesn't have any equivalent to that. And I think with MI5 particularly, there is a parallel with undercover police work and MI5 agents, but the police still have a certain degree of oversight, for good or bad. It might not work perfectly. But MI5 is the most legally protected and least accountable intelligence agency in pretty much the Western world. So they're operating without any meaningful oversight. And if they only have guidelines, we can see how badly that's gone over the last 15 years, where they have been implicated in cases where people have been rendered, where they've been tortured, and potentially where they've been killed. And this has gone back over decades, particularly with the troubles in Northern Ireland. So I do think this needs another proper look at by the government to put them on a proper legal footing with proper oversight and proper accountability.
Well, the very least, surely, that's required is that MI5 is placed on the same legal footing as MI6. It's unconscionable that you can get permission to commit an illegal act in a foreign country, but you don't have to ask permission to carry out an illegal act in our own country.
Absolutely. MI5 was put on a legal footing for the very first time in its 80-year existence at that stage in 1989 with the Security Service Act, and it has no mention of legalities around these sort of issues, which is why they only have guidelines. MI6 and GCHQ were put on a legal footing in 1994 with the Intelligence Services Act, and they do have legal footings for these sort of these acts. So there is a disparity between the three agencies. I have to say as well, though, that it was, when I was there, a hot ethical topic. People don't just blithely automatically follow orders, and people were concerned about how far you could go. They're not all baddies. There is a sort of certain sense of social conscience. However, if there are no legal penalties, if they go above and beyond, they commit crimes which are just, like the murder of Pat Finucane, as you mentioned, then that is where the problem starts, because there can be no legal penalties and no legal restitution for the families of the victims. That's what we're looking at here. And for David Cameron to have written this letter is, frankly, just not good enough.
The Finucane case is very personal to me. I knew him, I knew his wife, who was also wounded in the attack. I know his children very well. In this case, would seem to be the proximate reason for David Cameron's letter, because it was written 2 weeks before the D'Souza inquiry reported, and David Cameron did a very good job, I must say, at the dispatch box, very persuasively, contritely, accepting responsibility for the murder and expressing in quite heartfelt terms, I felt. I was quite impressed by him that day, the deep regret of the state at this killing. Because for those who don't know the case as well as you and I, he was not just killed by an agent of the British Security Services. Almost certainly the address, timings, and other necessary logistics were provided by our services. It's a case that is heartrending, but also extremely frightening, because it happened in what the British state regards as our own country, and it involved the killing, therefore, of a citizen of our own country. It's hard to exaggerate the importance of that.
Absolutely. And there were other cases during the Civil War in Northern Ireland as well. I mean, not least the case of Steak Knife, who was an MI5 agent, apparently working undercover, who was allowed to go around killing other lower-level agents, allegedly, in order to build up his profile and build up his reputation within the Provisional IRA. So, I mean, these things have always gone on. I think the key problem is, though, yes, it's right to be appalled by what is going on with our own country, but I think it's also right to be appalled with what our intelligence agencies can then do abroad as well.
Sure, of course, yes.
It shouldn't be, it's human rights for all of us, right?
Sure,
or none of us. It has to be that way.
You're right to correct me on that. It's just, I think, for most British people, rather more shocking when it happens in our own country, though, as you infer, it really oughtn't to be. We do need security services, and it's good that we have ethical ones, as you describe them. The defence of the realm is a real thing. You've got the police doing the dotting of I's and crossing of T's and so on. Inevitably, those working in the undergrowth of intelligence work are not necessarily going to be quite as punctilious. How serious does the service, I know you can't talk openly about your time in the service, but what would your guess be in 2018? How will this have all gone down, the coverage on Channel 4 News and Now Tonight? How will it go down inside the service?
I would hope that they are concerned. I think the problem is that over the last 30 years, and this is the time period that this report is referring to, we've seen an inversion of roles between the police and the intelligence agencies. So way back in 1992, MI5 took on the lead role for investigating the Provisional IRA on the UK mainland. Since 9/11 particularly, their role in countering terrorism has accelerated massively and globally. And that used to be police work, where an attack happened, you gathered evidence and all the rest of it. And so MI5 is now applying its old counter-espionage skills with very little oversight or accountability to what essentially should be police counter-terrorism work. And that's why, conversely, we saw the undercover cop scandal emerge of all these police who were working undercover to investigate political activists. That's the work that MI5 used to do. So it's almost like they swapped roles. But the police have traditionally had more oversight, more accountability imposed on them. And MI5 uniquely has very, very little. And that is the key problem. And that is what this letter from David Cameron is exposing in all its gory detail. And we have seen, of course, since 9/11, case after case of MI5 and MI6 even being implicated in extraordinary rendition cases, kidnappings, and torture. But if they're doing what is essentially police-type intelligence work rather than counter-espionage intelligence work, surely they should be held to the same standards as the police as well.
Finally, Annie, I didn't ask you on for this, so don't answer if you don't want to. But we were talking earlier about the, I thought, quite farcical scenes in the, or pictures rather, of scenes in the Netherlands at The Hague of Russian intelligence officers. We're told that's what they are, with their 1980s technology sticking out of the boot of their car, which had to be pointed at the building. That was Johnny English minus, and not James Bond. Were you surprised at how, if they are GRU agents, how poor at their job they were?
Well, if they were indeed GRU agents, then, they should be very embarrassed. I think what we're seeing there is a ramping up of this whole Russiagate narrative. It's always the Russians doing this, the Russians doing that. But it was interesting that it was in yesterday's Guardian. There was one article about the story we were discussing before, about the Cameron letter. And then there was another article about this GRU alleged attack against the OPCW. Now, first of all, that means that British spies are breaking the law, and we're horrified. Oh, and the Russian spies are allegedly breaking the law, and we're horrified. What is the moral difference between the two? That's what spies are supposed to do, right, in the popular mythology.
Shock horror, spies go spying.
But the other point as well is when the Skripal story broke in March this year, under the terms of the Chemical Weapons Treaty, all the information as the investigation started with the OPCW based in The Hague should have been shared with the Russians as well. They offered repeatedly to try and help in that investigation to find out where exactly this nerve agent might have come from, which laboratory, etc. And against the terms of that convention, they have still not been allowed to get access to that information. So if indeed the GRU was pointing the boot of its car at the OPCW to try and hack and get some information, that's probably what you think your country's spies should be doing in protecting your national interest, right?
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment these days. Annie Machen, former MI5 intelligence officer, I'm grateful to you indeed for that fascinating insight behind the sublime port of our intelligence agencies. Let's take a break for some capitalist messages. Well, as I recall that, a right-wing politician tried to use that, but Bruce, the boss, stopped him. Let me know if you know the answer. X-Ray Vision says Alistair Darling warned the Tories not to cut too hard too fast, but the Tories just proceeded regardless. Pretty brutal when you consider that the people who bailed out the perpetrators were hit the hardest. And Damien says, lest you forget, George, the victim of Salisbury was a 44-year-old mother called Dawn Sturgis, and not some Russian spy who betrayed his country and got his just reward. Let's hear from Sean in London, in Waterloo no less, just round the corner. Sean, welcome.
Thank you, George.
Welcome.
Yes, I'd like to make several points on the theme of Russia that have come out tonight's excellent show, if I can.
Go ahead, yes.
So on you were asking the question, why the demonization of Putin? Now, obviously, this is a complex question, but there are 2 points that I'd like to make. First of all, there's the banal point that Putin kicked out a whole lot of oligarchs who were extremely rich and powerful people. They came to the West, and these people got to know the Western establishment. And I think ever since, these oligarchs basically want their property back, and they have a certain amount of influence on our establishment. But that's the banal reason. I think there's a more interesting philosophical reason for the hysteria of this Russophobia and the way it just persists and persists and persists. And that's because of Putin's assertion of Russia's national sovereignty. The Western establishment came out of the Cold War, and they, in my view, they still kind of adhere to the sort of Francis Fukuyama view that the West had won, and now that they were going to be in charge, and they cannot tolerate the fact that there is any challenge to that kind of Anglo-Saxon liberal hegemony from a country that they considered defeated. I mean, of course, the reason the Soviet Union collapsed is very complicated and, in my view, much more to do with the internal politics of the Soviet Union rather than just the external factors.
Well, look, I'm not going to pretend that I disagree with much of what you said. That would be dishonest. But I put this point, if you like, as devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Why did we continue to spy and subvert in Russia long before Putin, when our man, Boris Yeltsin, was the president. I made the point earlier. Skripal was recruited by the British security services in 1996 when Yeltsin was lying drunk on the floor and we were picking his pockets. The Western countries, the Western companies were picking Russia's pockets. So why were we still subverting them then?
Well, I think that may be to do with the fact that the Western establishment were never absolutely confident that they were going to keep control over this country. I mean, if you know the history of Russia, you know they've always been part of Europe, but not the same as Europe. And it's that deep-seated fear which leads me back to one of the other points I wanted to make that is so interesting about this Russophobia, that so many supposedly balanced and fair-minded liberals are prepared to adhere to it. And it's that fear of Russia. This theme of Russophobia, my goodness, it goes back to almost when Peter the Great came to this country at the end of the 17th century. A few years later, he was already being demonized. There has been this deep fear of Russia for many, many years, and I think they never felt they had complete control, and that would explain the issue of maintaining the intelligence surveillance.
Well, look, you've taught me something, Sean. I never knew that Peter the Great had come to this country. Thanks for that. There's a lot of people trying to get through, so I'll cut that short if you don't mind. Grayson is in Caterham. Go ahead, Grayson.
Hi, George. I just wanted to come back to you on the Skripals a little bit, but just also commend, I think, your last interviewee, Ali, the lady from the MI5, who I think actually said it.
Annie Mashon, yes.
Annie Mashon, yes. She absolutely got it absolutely right on her last point, that not surprisingly, the Russians were trying to find out what was going on because they were excluded from the OPCWA investigation completely against the protocol, and so it's, they did what they had to do. But I just wanted to add a
well, they didn't, of course. They got caught with their 80s technology in their open boot.
Sure.
I mean, wouldn't you, if you were a James Bond sitting in MI5, MI6 tonight, wouldn't you be thinking that actually we're up against a group of mugs here? Why are we worrying about them so much?
I would completely agree, George. I mean, there's a couple of other strange things about it. First of all, why this happened in April? Why is it only now, in October, that this story has come out? That's something of surely of some interest. And I think another thing is, yes, I mean, this is another thing. We're told all the time that, Putin has this super network, only spending $100,000 on Facebook adverts. He's changed the course of the presidential election in America. He hacks the WADA, the anti-doping computer.
Well, the latest one is the Macedonian referendum on whether to change the name of the country to North Macedonia.
Yes.
The fact that only 35% of the people actually voted in the referendum and 65% boycotted it is being put down to Facebook posts by the Russians. It gets a bit ridiculous, doesn't it?
Absolutely absurd. And the only people interfering in that election were all the American politicians, James Mattis and the NATO guy, Stoltenberg, who were parading through Skopje.
Well, I thought the funniest thing, I should have asked Annie Machan this actually, the funniest thing was the statement that was made during the week by a former MI6 man that they had made the wrong decision in interfering in Russia's election to help ensure the victory of Vladimir Putin in the first place. I'm not sure if he knew what he was admitting to, but that's what he said. Grayson, thanks for that. Sean Caden in Australia says interest rates at record lows is precisely the right time to invest in house building and infrastructure and indeed the people. Austerity is like telling the drowning man to just keep swimming whilst holding a flotation device. Political vandalism. And Loft Nuthouse, that is just the best Twitter name for those not as old as me. Nat Lofthouse was a very famous footballer, I think for Bolton Wanderers. Loft Nuthouse says the song is obvious. I Can't Dance by Genesis. Thanks to Simon Wolfendale, Esquire.
Won't back down.
Well, that's Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And to my absolute astonishment, his song was also used by a right-wing politician in an election. Quite a left field choice, that, for the individual involved. Now, Tyler Durden says, your MI5 lady guest sounds wise. Is she on Twitter? She is indeed, at Annie Machen. That's at ANNIEMACHON. I follow her myself. The same man, Tyler, says, where are the Moats ladies tonight? Norma not calling, Lizzie not calling. Cybrarian 64 is absent. Eva Sumbel and Robin are rumoured to be partying. Together, I hope. Even the nice lady from Dulwich, whose name I don't remember, unfortunately is absent. No sooner said than the sunshine arrives. It's the legend that is Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
You do make me laugh. George.
Yes.
This lecture in politics, this Edinburgh man earlier,
yes.
the Scotsman,
Yes.
about the Tory conference, I didn't really agree with him. I thought the conference was very dull and stage managed, and they're a very smug lot. And when Mrs. May made her speech, the vitriol that came out of her mouth about Jeremy Corbyn, I thought was appalling. When she'd been lecturing previously how to be really nice, you know. The only thing I did think was quite good, she's got plenty of personality, is Ruth Davidson, the Scottish leader, Tory leader. I didn't agree with her, but...
It is extraordinary.
She gave a good speech.
A lesbian who's expecting a baby, who's a former army officer, and who's the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, and is spoken of as a potential leader of the British Conservative Party, though she's ruled that out herself. Well, she's certainly not bland.
No, but I mean, she wasn't nasty. And when she speaks, people wake up. She's a good orator, you know.
Very good point, Norma.
I mean, it's just, I know we've got a lot of people coming on.
But
I mean,
she'll never become the... First of all,
No.
she'd need to abandon the Scottish Conservatives.
Yeah,
And then
no.
she'd need to find a Westminster seat, probably not in Scotland.
No, she won't,
And she'd have to do all that very, very quickly. So
No, she wouldn't. But just
trust me,
quickly-
Boris is the next Tory leader. Trust me on that.
Oh, come on. But the thing is, just quickly, she didn't cover things like the prison service. They're in dire straits at the moment. She almost thinks that if you have a council house, which is quite good if you're just an ordinary family, you're almost a second-class citizen. I mean, she wants to blooming wake up.
Well, I grew up in a council house and I was very glad of it because I only got it because my slum tenement was knocked down. Thanks very much for that, Norma. Dana says nobody cares about what's going on in the Conservative Party. You sure, Dana? I mean, they are actually the government. But he goes on, please stop this Conservative Party political broadcast. 15 minutes of this rubbish. Well, me presiding over a Conservative Party political broadcast. I've got to be fair and balanced, guys. You know that this radio station is regulated by Ofcom, don't you? Bob Justice says, May's government has come to a grinding halt, mired in internal problems. A flashback to Major's day. Leadership campaign was the last person standing farce. She won an inglorious general election. Even the sound bites have gone. I'm no fan, but Boris is the only credible option. And X-Ray Vision says the Tories are still proceeding with the intended cuts. So how exactly is austerity going to end? And Paul Booker says, I thought for a second George was about to have a Theresa May conference moment, then cough, cough. Yes, it came upon me unexpectedly, Paul. It had no political significance for the Kremlinologists out there. Neil Rose says, time is not on his side. Corbyn will never win friends, so he should have moved far quicker. He's in his 4th year as leader. Open selection should be here. Anyone should be able to stand for leader etc. And Bob says, I think if self-declared moderates back May, it's another nail in the coffin of liberal centrism. They'll have betrayed their main supporter base. Ardent Remain types are hardly happy with Chequers and will be left bereft unless they're all disingenuous. How such wonderful words crammed into one small tweet. Quite extraordinary. John Locke says, Bruce Springsteen rightly objected to Ronald Reagan, Bob Dole and Pat Buchanan and their unauthorized use of Born in the USA in their 1984 campaigns. He asked if they had actually listened to his songs. Hashtag ABBA, hashtag Maybot, hashtag Moats. Yep, that's right. Bruce, who you may recall. If you don't, let me tell you. Bruce made a massive donation to the miners out on strike in the 1984-85 British miners' strike. Bruce Springsteen is a real American hero, and he would certainly never let Pat Buchanan, Bob Dole, or Ronald Reagan nick his songs. And Paul Whitelam says Reagan wanted to use Born in the USA in the 84 re-election campaign, but Bruce said no. He has often introduced the song by saying it has been misunderstood by Republicans, followed by, and I'm sure we don't have any Republicans in the House tonight. You know, if the Democratic Party in the United States had stayed true to its blue-collar industrial roots, all those Rust Belt states would never have been lost to Donald Trump in the presidential election 2 years ago. If Bruce Springsteen had been the face of the American Democrats rather than Hillary Clinton, they might have done rather better.
Calling out around the world, are you ready for a brand new beat?
Well, that would have actually been just as appropriate for Theresa's dance routine, even though there's an absence of people dancing in the street in Britain these days. But David Bowie was quite right-wing and is in any case now deceased. And, well, Mick Jagger certainly ain't no street-fighting man. Exile on Main Street, he long ago made. Now, Tony X, the protest board, my good friend, says Nat Lofthouse's last words were, I've got the ball now, it's a bit worn, but I've got it. And yes, Bolton Wanderers. Thanks for that, Tony. I remember I used to get every year a book called The Topical Times. I'm sure it's no longer published, but was a review of the year past in football. And it had beautifully printed plates, colour plates of footballers. You felt you were right next to the players. You could almost touch them. And I had one in one book of Nat Lofthouse. Jimmy says, it's not on topic, but could you wish Ty Woffenden all the best in the Polish Grand Prix? He needs 12 points to become World Speedway Champion for a third time to beat the late Peter Craven's record and become the UK's most successful rider. Well, I will do that, Jimmy, though this could be an entire scam, because I've never heard of Ty Woffenden and know nothing about Speedway. But assuming that you are acting in good faith, I'll do that. I wish Ty Woffenden all the best in the Polish Grand Prix. Words I never thought I'd hear myself saying. Here's another legend. It's Lizzie in Gloucester. Go ahead, Lizzie.
Hi, George.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks. Now, you disagree with me about the Tories. Go on.
Well, I just wanted to say that of all the things that you could have spoken about, you didn't really speak much about the emptiness of the conference and the reasons why that might be so.
You must have nipped out to make a cup of tea then, because I made that point 3 times.
Oh, did you?
Yes, 3 times.
I did nip out.
I spoke about Sajid Javid's. The Home Secretary's speech used to be a highlight of Tory conferences. They used to announce all kinds of ghastly, draconian punishments. Oh, and the crowd would gasp and yell. It was always a blue note day at the Tory conference, but Sajid Javid spoke to a hall that looked to me 3/4 empty.
Yes, it was. Yes, the galleries upstairs were all entirely empty, as were the last 20 rows of seats. And you know why? Because, of course, it was $850 a day for a press pass. It was $650 a day, I believe, for any members or delegates.
£650 a day?
Yes, that's a great deal of money, isn't it?
My goodness, no wonder it was empty.
Yeah. Well, and, I mean, apart from the fact that who do they think is supporting these policies that they're bringing out? Nobody's supporting them, are they?
Well, of course they are, because the Tories are ahead in the polls. In the poll today, they're 6 points ahead of Labour.
Yeah, but
with neither party having moved up or down after their conference.
But who creates those polls?
Yeah, it was a YouGov poll, which traditionally overemphasises Tory support. That's true. But if you took the polls as a whole over the last few weeks, the Tories are ahead. So you'd be unwise to imagine that Labour is going to skate the general election when it comes, Lizzie.
Yeah, I would say the same on that particular question, because the whole Brexit thing has coloured all that, hasn't it? Although, like I said to you last week, who is talking about Brexit apart from the pundits and mainstream media? Even really, people on the street aren't talking about it. They're far too concerned with the fact that they all mostly have to use food banks, that there's no teachers at their schools, that the teachers are striking, that McDonald's are striking, that the trains are striking,
Things seem to be rattling down a bit. That's true. Do you think the promise that it's the end of austerity might halt that rattling down?
No, but I suppose to the people that haven't heard it 16 months earlier, perhaps, or that believed it then and believe it now, or the people that are gullible.
Well, again, I make this point, Lizzie. If you look, and I just did earlier this evening, at the local government by-elections over the last period. Now, obviously, there's serendipity in there. By-elections cannot be predicted. Someone has died, resigned, gone to jail, or whatever. There could be all kinds of local factors. But if you take the local election results over the last 12 months, and if you take the opinion polls, the best that you can say is that the country is split 50-50 between Labour and the Conservatives. Actually, you'd have to say that the Liberal Democrats have made something of a comeback in real elections as well as polls, and that UKIP are making a comeback.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The Lib Dems, really, I want everybody who believes in Remain to back the Lib Dems, because wouldn't that be a beautiful picture? The Conservatives out of the picture, and it be a parliament made up of Lib Dem, Labour, Green, SNP. Wouldn't that be it? Or Plaid Cymru? Wouldn't that be a fantastic government?
Would you support a Labour-Liberal coalition government?
Well, I would, but I'm not sure that the Lib Dems would. But
do you think Jeremy Corbyn would?
I think so.
That's very interesting. Lizzie, thanks for that. I need to press on. David is in Ireland. Let's hear from him. David.
Hi there, George. How are you doing?
Good, sir. Good. Thanks a lot. Go on.
All right. Quick one. Modern monetary theory, MMT, and Dr. Stephanie Kelton is the lady you should be talking to more than me. But the truth of the matter is that austerity is an absolute lie. Government deficits in sovereign currency countries is a lie. The government creates money out of thin air and essentially doesn't owe the debt to anyone other than itself. So when you realize that all these stories about the Rothschilds and the banks creating money is a lie, and that this money is actually can only be created by the government itself, then you begin to realize how evil austerity is, because there's no need for it. But what they've done is they've used the excuse, austerity, to take the money that they create and hand it back to the banksters and to the people that are at the top. And in the meantime, everyone's fighting about, how we're going to pay for it. You don't need to worry about paying for anything. You've got a printing press. You can print it up to the time that you have full employment. And if you go beyond that point, then you'll have inflation. But you manage it through taxes. Taxation is what you use to ensure that inflation doesn't destroy your currency.
And what about imports and exports? Unless everyone was doing that, unless everyone abolished the money system, then you would have a grotesque imbalance in trade, because your currency, being printed on that press, would be worthless to the exporter of goods to you in Germany, unless his country was also printing money, irrespective of the impact.
You can get involved in terms of the details, in terms of exports and imports, but in fact, if you think about it...
That's exactly what I'm doing. I mean, what you're projecting is what Lenin called primitive communism. It can only work in a self-contained village economy. As soon as you start trading with other people who are not in the same system as you, that whole thesis of yours falls down.
Sean, George, it's not a thesis. It's not mine. This is research that's been going on for 4 or 5 decades by people that are very
of course, I know that. There's a party in Britain called the SPGB that has been punting that all of my life. I've read it all. I know that the smoke and mirrors of the capitalist money system, and I know what it's like. But when you have a world economy, especially a country like Britain, which requires people to buy its goods and services, if your money is essentially worthless, i.e. is unconnected to productivity, the production of real wealth in your economy, is merely how fast you can run your printing machine, then nobody can do business with you.
George, that's so that's the argument that you're pointing out is the one that you get to the point where you've passed full employment, and you keep on printing the presses, but the reality, this is not a theory.
No, but this is a thesis for.
It's not a thesis. George, this is what exists today.
Well, you just said it wasn't your thesis, but it's somebody's thesis.
This is how currencies are created. Who has the right in England to create the English?
No, look. If you just put the machine to switch and produced billions, why not trillions of pounds?
Because you'd have to stop. You have to realize that aggregate demand in an economy has to meet aggregate supply. So you can continue to, a government can continue to feed into an economy to the point where there are products and services to be purchased. If it prints beyond that point, then yes, you're right. You get to that point where your currency is worth nothing. But under full employment, that is not the case.
If Britain had a hermetically sealed economy in which a form of primitive communism had been declared, and there's a lot of big ifs in both of those, that could theoretically work. But as soon as you had to buy things from outside, until you had to sell things outside, unless all the economies in the world had abandoned the money system and gone in for a form of barter, that just simply couldn't work. And, moreover, I wouldn't want it to work because it is primitive and it doesn't actually meet the needs of the modern society in the world, the globalized society that we have. Here's David in Hull. Go ahead, David.
Oh, hello, Mr. Galloway.
Yes, sir.
I heard you saying before that you thought it was criminals who had been involved in the Salisbury.
I do, yeah. It's my hunch, yeah. I mean, I can't prove it, but it's my hunch.
The only thing is, I can't see how that makes any more sense.
Tell me then.
Well, For instance, you said that Russian spies wouldn't be using public transport.
On a Sunday.
Well,
To escape.
criminals
To
with
escape.
lots of money wouldn't be using public transport.
Well, I mean, that just seems like a standout point to me. Forgive me if I haven't persuaded you of it. If you had come all the way from Moscow to carry out what would inevitably be a global scandal, you would at least have hired a car. Or somebody
Yes,
would have hired a car on your behalf. You wouldn't be depending to catch your flight out back to Moscow on the Sunday service of British Railways.
But some criminal organisation would not be either.
Well, I'm working on the assumption that what happened in Salisbury was not meant to happen. It's my thesis, you've heard me say it many times here, if you're a regular listener, that this can be compared to a kind of drug deal gone wrong. I don't believe that what happened was supposed to happen. I need to go. It'll all come out in the wash, David. David Leviscont says, some voters just amaze me. How can they be beaten with a stick for years and then vote for the same stick to carry on beating them? I suppose it's a case of better the stick you know. A very clever and witty way to sum up from one of our many clever students and fellow teachers at the Open University of the Airwaves. Well, I think it's been marvellous. I hope it was for you. And if it was, you can come back here next week at the same time, I hope. And I'll still be here. It's still the mother of all talk shows, whatever you've heard to the contrary. Good night.